Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and watching that film. I hope you all found it very educational, I think. I found it particularly disturbing when I watched it. But what I'd like to say to you about Tantura is that Tantura is not the Nakba. The Nakba goes far, far beyond that tiny massacre that happened when you look at what happened across the whole of Palestine in 1948. I think it's very important that we look at this film in this context, and we have with us an esteemed panel that Yasmin will introduce in a minute. But before I allow Yasmin to introduce the panel, I want to introduce Yasmin to you. Yasmin Ahmed is the UK Director of Human Rights Watch. She is an extraordinarily experienced lawyer. She's worked for the UK and Australian governments. She is, I think the best way to introduce Yasmin is that to the ICJP, and I would put Yasmin as one of the foremost defenders of human rights and one of the best advocates for human rights that I've had the pleasure of meeting. Yasmin, I just want to hand over to you.
Thank you so much. That's an incredibly kind introduction. And before I start and introduce the esteemed panel, I want to take a moment to thank ICJP for bringing us here, for providing the voice, the platform, and ensuring that there is constant advocacy and accountability in respect of what's happening in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, and ensuring that we're not only looking at what is happening now, but as this film rightly says, we need to obviously consider the historical context in which the ongoing harms against Palestinians occur. So thank you very much for providing us with this platform. Before I introduce as well, as I said, my esteemed colleagues, I want to also take a moment to say that this film will allow us to consider the Nakba, consider the current situation of Palestinians, and allow us to unpeel quite a number of layers. And I'm sure as you watch this film, as I did, there are a number of layers, there are a number of questions that no doubt you will be asking yourself. And I hope we as a panel will be able to explore some of those questions. Some of the people on this panel will raise questions, and I think very important questions about this film. This film not only raises questions for us, but we should be turning around and looking at this film as well, and you will hear that. So I will not go on any further because I really want to enjoy the discussion and hear from these colleagues. But before I do, I am going to introduce them. So as many of you know, this is Professor Avi Shlaim. He is an esteemed academic in the field and an Emeritus Fellow at St. Anthony's College and a former Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford. He's a leading scholar of the Middle East, and his main research interest is in the Arab-Israeli conflict. I have written on this piece of paper the many, many books that Avi has written, and it will probably take us all night for me to say those. So I will just say that he is an esteemed author, and he is an incredible who stands by the Palestinians and the Palestinians' cause. We also have Hala Gabriel, and it is my honor to be sitting on this panel with you as well, Hala. Hala Gabriel works as a television and film producer and is also in the finance professional. Most recently, she served as a production finance executive at Netflix, overseeing series production. She is established as a formidable production controller and has worked on a high-profile feature films and television series, including Shadow and Bone, Yellowstone, Brother's Son, The Blacklist, House of Lies, and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Hala has dedicated over a decade producing and directing a feature-length documentary film about her father's village, Tantura, located south of Haifa, as we've seen, in historic Palestine. The film is currently in post-production, And it is absolutely my pleasure to be sitting here with you today as a descendant of the victims, as a family of the victims of Tantura. It is a pleasure for us to have you on the panel.
Thank you for having me.
And last but by no means least is Professor Noor Masala. So Professor Noor Masala is a professor of history at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University in London, and is an expert on the history and politics of Palestine and Israel. He's an editor of a journal of Holy Land and Palestine Studies published by the Edinburgh University Press. He's the author of many books on Palestine and Israel. His current work focuses on religion and politics in the Middle East, oral history and social memory theory, New Palestine and Israel historiography, the Bible and Zionism, Holy Land, Jerusalem archaeology, theories of liberation in Palestine, and lifelong learning in Palestine. So I'm going to start with you, Avi, and I want you to explain to us, you've been, as a historian and as an academic, you've been studying the Nakba. And I want you to tell me about what this film says to you. And I would also like you to, and what it says about the broader context of the Nakba, which was very important. It was not only about Tantura, it's about the broader context of the Nakba. And I would be really interested to also talk to you about, ask you about whether you saw racism as a central feature of what happened during the Nakba, and how that continues to play out in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories today.
Thank you. What struck me most about this film is that it's Israelis talking to one another and Israelis arguing about themselves. Israelis who have different narratives of what happened in 1948. And the victims of that war hardly get a look in. So it's a very Israeli film, and in a subtle or not so subtle kind of way, it upholds the Zionist narrative. Although it's not uncritical, but there is a lot of rejoicing and celebration of the creation of the State of Israel. And the music is very evocative of that Zionist fervor for the establishment of the State of Israel. The reason why the film arouses such strong feelings, such strong passions, is because it goes to the core of Israel's perception of itself. And Israel's perception of itself is of a very decent, liberal, peace-loving country, which was surrounded by predatory Arabs, and it had no choice but to stand up and defend itself. So this is a defensive war. And there is great reluctance to look at the dark side of this war, particularly at the ethnic cleansing that happened in 1948. The broader historical context for this film is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. In 1948, over 500 Arab villages were destroyed. 750,000 Palestinians were made refugees. And there were, Benny Morris counted 28 massacres, of which Tantura is only one. So it's not an isolated episode. And Benny Morris counted 12 rapes. So this is the Nakba, this is the ethnic cleansing. There is a historical debate as to whether the ethnic cleansing was premeditated and pre-planned, whether there was a master plan for the expulsion of the Palestinians. And Professor Noor is the expert, and he's written many books, but his first book was called Expulsion. It's about transfer. In Zionist jargon, transfer is a soft word for ethnic cleansing, for expulsion, for mass expulsion of. So Nur Masalha and Ilan Pape believe that there was a Zionist master plan for the expulsion of the Palestinians. Benny Morris, who has studied the refugee problem in great depth, believes that there was no Zionist master plan, that it just happened during the war. Now, I'd like to make 2 points. One is that it doesn't really matter whether there was a master plan or not for the victims. Because if you're a peasant who were driven away from his land and lost his home, does it matter whether the order came from David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, or the chief of staff, or a second lieutenant in command of a platoon locally? It doesn't matter. What matters is the result. So yes, there was ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the systematic emptying of Palestine of its Arab inhabitants. And your second question was about, was there a racist dimension to this conflict? And the answer is most certainly there was a racist element, because Zionism is an avowedly settler colonial movement. The State of Israel, the main political product of Zionism, the State of Israel is a settler colonial movement. Noam Chomsky once said that settler colonialism is the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism. The Palestinians have been singularly unlucky. They've been at the receiving end of both British imperialism and Zionist settler colonialism. Colonialism is racist. The Balfour Declaration was a classic colonial document which treated the Palestinians as rubbish, as if they just didn't count. The Zionist movement was a settler colonial movement. And settler colonialism isn't about peaceful coexistence with the natives. It has an eliminatory logic. It's about eliminating the natives and replacing them, taking over their place. So settler colonialism isn't about coexistence. It's about emptying the country in order to be able to take over the land and its resources. And this is what happened. It's a feature of conflicts and of settler colonialism in particular to demonize the other, to demonize the enemy. Because by demonizing the other, you justify the kind of massacres and cruelty and atrocity that we saw documented in this film.
Thank you so much, Professor Avi. I'm sure there'll be a number of questions, but I'll now turn over to Hala. Hala, what Professor Avi said, it certainly struck me that this was very much through an Israeli lens. And the film in itself talked about the way that Israel has controlled the narrative from the very beginning. And I would like to hear from you as someone whose family were in Tantura, who were expelled from your land, and who now cannot return to your land, about how you engaged with this film. How did it make you feel? And also I noted there was the highest the film got to was a recognition of the harms. but there really wasn't a sense and a focus on accountability. And I'd love to hear from you as to how you experienced that.
Well, to give you a little background, my family actually owns 90% of the land of Tantura, although it was apparently, after it was ethnically cleansed, Ben Gurion gave it to the Jewish National Fund, who then gave it to the kibbutz to build their like resort that exists today. But somewhere out there is a land deed with my family's name on it. So I just to have a little context. So I've also been, as I mentioned to you, I've been working on a film about Tantura for quite a few years. I have not been sponsored like alone. So he got like a real advantage from having the sponsorship that allowed him to finish his film within 3 years. I've been working on mine for quite a few years, and my film has a lot of the witnesses that survived the massacre, including my uncle, my dad, and some of my other relatives that were physically there on that day. This film, I think I read an article shortly after this film came out that, when it comes to the story of Israel, like the truth is never the truth unless an Israeli Jew says it. So as long as the Palestinians are telling our story, it's made up, or our memories or our emotions, or there's always something that will minimize or disqualify or like plant a seed of doubt or question. When an Israeli makes a film, there's no question. It's the truth, But sadly, my film was a rough cut of my film was submitted to Sundance several years ago, and my understanding was that the panel, that there was more than half of the panel were Israel sympathizers. And so it came back to me from one of the people working at Sundance at the time that the chances of my film having gotten accepted would be slim. And sure enough, she was right. My film did not get selected. A month later, Alon calls me to tell me he wanted to help me with my film, but then told me he was making his film on Tantura. And then it became kind of clear that there wasn't really any help being offered. It was really more that he was fishing for his own film, which is fine. He's got the right to make his film, and he's made this film, it's a good film. I mean, but it is definitely through the lens of the Israelis.
And you said to me something about the dining table you talked to me about when we were...
Yeah, so in the very beginning of his film, when the women talk about coming, having dinner at the, they call him the sheikh, the Mukhtar's house, that's my family's home. So they came and they said, oh, it was set up for us. It wasn't set up for them. It was set up for my family. So the day of the attack, the attack actually started on May 22nd in the evening and didn't end until May 23rd in the early morning. So after the attack, they had taken, my father was 15 years old at the time, and two of the militia soldiers took my dad to walk around the village to see who was wounded. And my dad was 15, and my dad said to me, the only thing I was thinking about is, we caught this beautiful fish yesterday, and my mom was marinating it, and when were we going to have time to go eat it? Mm-hmm. So of course, when I see this, and it's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Again, I imagine there'll be quite a number of questions for you, but thank you very much for sharing that. And that this is part of what I was saying about unpicking the layers of this film. Important, but also very important to think about how we're viewing it, from what lens we're viewing it, and what it tells us.
But I want to mention just one thing, just based on what you mentioned. I don't like, when I hear the word war, like referenced in this, like to me, when I think of war, I think of two armed armies. And that wasn't the case. These were civilians. These were not, like, the Palestinians didn't have an army. The Arabs had an army. Yes, there was that war, but the village of Tantura did not have an army. Mm-hmm. It had like maybe 10 guns and some civilians that were trained as police officers by the British. Mm. This battle that happened in Tantura did not happen with two military presence. It happened with civilians trying to save their homes and their lives, and a very armed group of militiamen from the Palmach and the Haganah you know, so just to make sure that people understand that this was not really a war. So
And I think these are the things about, I think, controlling the narrative, which is very important, because they, as you said, it can be quite easily perceived in certain ways and potentially constructed in certain ways.
Yes.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. I'm now going to move to Professor Noor. And Professor Noor, I'm not going to ask you a question because you said to me, don't ask me a question. I have what I want to say prepared.
Initially, I wanted to read something, but I'll just
please.
agree with Avi and agree with Hala also. By the way, it's not the Haganah and the Palmach who did it. It's the official Israeli army. When we talk about after the 15th of May, there's an official Israeli army. This is an official Israeli brigade called Alexandrun. We had a massacre carried out by the Irgun and the militias before that, Deir Yassin. But here we're talking about the Israeli state and the official Israeli army. This is something else.
The same people.
And these are Israeli soldiers acting in the name of the Israeli state. So that's the difference between 15th of May before and after that. And this is happening on the 22nd, the night of 22nd. I want to disagree. I actually agree with Avi on so many things and on so many levels, because we as historians have been arguing about this for so many years. And also, it's not just me, but also Ilan Pappé is part of that kind of new kind of ways of thinking about. And also, I feel very sorry for Teddy Kollek for personal reasons. About 20 years ago, when the whole thing, 25 years ago, 20 years ago, when his thesis was disqualified, Ilan Pappé was teaching at Haifa University, and he wrote to me an email. He said, Noor, can you help with Teddy? I said, why? He said, Teddy wrote a thesis which was disqualified, and I would like you to have him as a PhD student. I said, well, his MA was disqualified. How can I actually? And he told me the whole story in an email, and then he wrote an article which I published in a journal I edit, Journal for Land Palestine Studies, published in 2004, the full story of Teddy Katz, and his court, and the fact that he had a breakdown, and also confessed of doctoring things, and then retracted that confession. And Ilan told me the whole story. I think the story is the most painful story, and the attempt to silence him. This was 2004. So the story about the massacre of Tantura from the Israeli side actually is being publicized in the last 20 years. This film is not new in terms of new discoveries. Ilan, friend of mine, has been publicizing it in talks and in the social media, and we've been publishing so much about it on Facebook for so many years. But there's something interesting about this film, because as Alvis says, this is an internal Israeli debate. This has nothing to do with the Nakba. This is not a narrative of the Nakba. I'm sorry to disappoint the center here. This is not a film about the Palestinian Nakba. This is not about the refugees. This is not about the victims of the Nakba. This is about internal Israeli debates and how Israelis debate these things. And also, some acknowledge and some deny. And this is also a film funded by the Israeli Ministry of Culture and Sports. You have to remember that. The Israeli Ministry of Culture and Sport and the Israeli Council of Films funded this film. Is it a Hasbara film? Hasbara is propaganda in Hebrew. No, it's much more subtle than that. But it's a film about Israeli perspective, and it's a Zionist perspective, and or multiple Zionist perspectives we can talk about here. It's very little to do with voices. There are no Palestinian voices there. Two Palestinians from Tantura has been interviewed, and the third Palestinian from within the Green Line, the last guy who was talking about going to Tantura, and I think he's from Fridis. But mainly Israelis talking about the Nakba. So the Palestinians, as you said, are silenced here. There are no also there are no consequences for this. The impression you have that the people actually talking about the Nakba, but they don't feel guilt at all. They actually, those people who carry out, who acknowledge carrying out the atrocities, actually laugh throughout the things. And I actually find it incredibly annoying, actually. How can you talk about the Holocaust without feeling rage in yourself? The Jewish Holocaust I'm talking about. How can you talk about the Nakba and laughing in this way? It's like nothing. The context, of course, is the war. The context presented here is the war. And there's a different context, which Abby hinted at it, which is the planning of the transfer. And this is something actually, I published a whole book about it, going through Israeli archival sources and Hebrew archival sources, Hebrew being a Hebrew speaker, familiar with Israeli. And I began with, it actually covers the whole period, 50 years before the Nakba, but mainly focusing on the mid-30s. And the reason why the Zionist leadership in Palestine decided the only way is to clear them out. Transfer becomes that solution in the mid-30s, because they come to the conclusion you can't carry on with settlements, one dunam here, because the Palestinians remain the vast majority in the country, and Jewish settlements in the country, Jewish land ownership, Zionist land ownership, was about 10% in 1947. So by the mid-30s, there's a decision. They set up transfer committees in the mid-30s, and they talk about the only ways to clear them. And Ben-Gurion talks about expulsion, Girush in Hebrew. He talks about Girush in 1937. He talks about Girush in 1948. For him, it was Girush. So the question is, master plan, no master plan. This is perhaps slightly red herring. You don't, as Elon said, you don't need actually a master plan to clear people out. But I think there was a mindset. By the time they get to 1948, the mindset is to clear out the Palestinians, who are the majority in the country, because otherwise you cannot create a Jewish state in a country with another majority. In 1947, the Jewish community in Palestine, after all that immigration, was about 1/3 of the population, and the Palestinians were 2/3. And if you notice, the film actually begins with the UN partition plan. It actually, the first thing they do is begin with the UN partition plan. The UN partition plan decided on two-state solution, if you like, and allocated 55% to the Jewish state. The reason why the producer actually go for that, because it does give international legitimacy. This is against part of the Zionist perspective. If the world decided to recognize the Jewish state, it must be, that state must be legitimate. Whatever terrible things happened in 1948, whatever atrocities that we did, the project, there was a higher project, which is actually creating a Jewish state, actually. So here you can see also another Zionist perspective. It says, the trouble is that Israel did not abide by that resolution. That resolution talked about 50%. The Israelis occupied 75% in 1948. The Israelis did not abide by the partition resolution. They did not abide by the right of return resolution, which is 1948. The right of the people of Tantura to return back, it was enshrined in the UN resolution 194 in December 1940. The Israelis did not accept that resolution, did not abide by that. The Israelis did not abide by any single UN resolution since 1947. We have 200 UN resolutions. This is center about law, isn't it? This is a center about law, international law, abiding by law. It's the only country which is a member of the UN which never abided by any UN resolution. About 200 of them we counted. So for the director to begin with the UN resolution in order to give legitimacy to this film and to the Israeli perspective, while not telling us that the UN actually did not vote on expelling the Palestinians, and the Palestinians would have been about 50% of that Jewish state if that Jewish state stuck to 55%, not to 78%. Within the 78% occupied by Israel in 1948, you'd have an Arab majority. Israel could not have survived as a Jewish state. This is where the context This is where the framing of that film as a, if you like, a Zionist narrative. But the key point I wanted to, this is something to just to highlight what Avi was saying about me being an expert on transfer. I'm not an expert on anything in particular in the world, but I wrote a book about the idea of transfer in Zionism. And unlike most Israeli historians, I think Ilan Pappé actually is actually on my side in this. And I think Avi is very much actually on the same side. Also, Israeli historians looked at 1948 and they insist on talking about because there's a context of war in 1948, and more terrible things do happen. Also, 1948 came after the Holocaust. You see, we have a number of references to the Holocaust. These people actually coming from the Holocaust, from extermination camps, and therefore they did terrible things. There's a kind of rationalization, there's kind of excusing these people. There's no attempt by Israeli historians, perhaps with the exception of Ilan Pappé, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. In the introduction, he says, if you want to read my book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, you have to read Noor's book on the planning of transfer. This is where Ilan and I and Avi actually agree on a whole range of things, including the question. So the question of the context, how do you contextualize 1948? It's easy for the Israelis to talk about 1948 because it's war, in war, terrible things do happen. And we have an acknowledgement. I mean, some of them do acknowledge atrocities, by the way, although they don't feel guilt and they want to move on and they don't want to remember, and some want, to have some sort of landmark, and some don't want it, and this and that. But the reason why all this internal Israeli debate is also partly because they don't want the Palestinian refugees to come back. That's the key issue. The question is, why talk about 1948 while you refusing the Palestinian right to return? What's the point of it? Acknowledgement? There is something in it. Recognition. There's something, but not fully actually. This film is quite confusing because an awful lot of these soldiers actually don't acknowledge. So there are confusing narratives. And if you are an outsider, not a historian like me or Avi, you could be quite confused by this film. It could be very confusing to the uninformed people. So I do find this film actually very problematic, and also not honest, not completely honest. Teddy Katz is an honest person. You can see the pain. Ilan Pappé is honest. I mean, I think you can see some of these people really are grieving. But the vast majority of those Israeli soldiers interviewed from the Alexandronian Brigade don't feel the guilt, even those who acknowledge it. And that's the crux of this issue.
Thank you very much for all of your thoughts about the film and about the broader issues with respect to the Nakba and the subsequent crimes that continue to today. I did want to say something though, and I think this is important, is to say what came from me, and in fact some of the engagement that I've been having as the director of Human Rights Watch with some members of the Jewish community, is I think that there is a really important, like whilst 100% accepting the fact that there isn't accountability built into this, and there is not a lot of self-reflection, I think that there is something really important to be taken away about the trauma that these individuals had from the Holocaust, the very real trauma that they brought to them, with them, when they came to Palestine. And I felt, in any event, that trauma was replayed out on the Palestinian victims of that. But I felt that very much. And I think that is very important part of the contextualizing of this film, but also of the discussion. In no way does it excuse any of the acts that may have been performed, and will it ever? But I do think that the sense of traumatization from the Holocaust that then leaks into and informs the trauma of the Palestinians is a very important background to this. I'm going to now open it up to questions. I would ask, and in fact, I'm going to be quite strict on this because I'm going to take my job seriously. I do not want people to set out their opinions on things. I want specific questions, please. And if you don't have a specific question, then you're welcome to come after this and discuss with any of the panelists your perspectives. I also appreciate that this is a highly contentious issue with some individuals. And so I appreciate that this can be quite a difficult discussion to have. But I will say that we need to remain respectful in that discussion. And I'm absolutely, I know that every individual will do that and respect one another in this discussion. So I have a lady in the middle who has her hand up. I think there will be a microphone, am I right? Just on there, on your right, will be coming down. So I'll start with you and then I'll come to you, the gentleman at the front here.
Thank you. Gillian Mosley, excuse me, BAFTA award-winning filmmaker. Very quickly, I'm sorry, but I do need to push back slightly. I am Jewish, but this started in the 1910s, 1920s, before then, before the Holocaust happened. So I think it's important to remember that when contextualizing. I had a lot of problems with the structure of this film along the lines of what's been discussed. But I did wonder whether any of you think there is potentially the power to make people in Israel reflect on the basis of a film like this.
Thank you.
In a useful way.
Thank you. And thanks for your clarification. I'm going to take 4 questions and then I'm going to ask. So now we had a gentleman here at the front who was going to ask a question. So we'll go here next. Thank you.
Thank you. Luca Salice, don't you think that the desire of some of the characters interviewed to forget is in itself a sign that they feel guilty? And even the laughter that they are, though shocking as it is, don't you think that the laughter is a mask which hides their guilt, their sense of guilt for what they have done all those years ago?
Thank you very much.
Can I make a comment, please?
Can I just take?
I'm sorry.
I'll just take 2 more
Yeah.
because we'll probably have quite a lot of questions. There's a lady here.
Right, thank you. My name is Rada Karmi. In terms of what was said about the fact that this is a film made from with an Israeli perspective, I completely agree. But do you not think that it presents really a valuable insight for many people who aren't following this so closely, a valuable insight into how Zionists think, how these people actually think? For me, I benefited a lot, I must say, and God knows I live this issue the whole time, but I learned quite a lot. And I think, would you not think that the value of the film is very much in displaying very vividly the variety of feelings and memories and contradictions amongst Israelis who committed this? And just one other question. Who do you think the film was made for? Who is the intended, who are the intended viewers? So I think that's very important.
Thank you so much. They were 2 insightful questions. I will go to this gentleman at the very back. I see there's a gentleman at the very back in the corner. And then I will open it up to discussion.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Azam Tamimi, and my question to the panel, all of you. Professor Avi Shleim said, answering your question, Yasmin, about whether there was racism in what happened in Tantura, he agreed, but he related that to imperialism or colonialism. What about Zionism as an ideology? couldn't the ideology of Zionism, which tells Zionists that they have a divine right to come and take my mother's house and my father's land and throw us in the diaspora with utter disrespect for our humanity. Isn't the ideology Zionism responsible for this?
Thank you very much. So I will go, just a reminder of the questions, there was two questions which were very similar, which was about the usefulness of this film. Is there a usefulness? Who was the intended audience? Was there not valuable insights that came from this film? Somebody asked about the guilt. Did you not feel that there was guilt that came through, even though it may have been through laughter, but or other expressions? But can people express guilt through different ways? And the last question was about whether the ideology of Zionism is inherently racist. So I will open it up to whomever wants to start, but I will ask you to try and keep it precise, because I'm sure there'll be another round of questions. Did you want to start?
Well, I wanted to mention something, like why I said what I said about the soldiers is because I actually met with the commander who led the attack on Tantura, and he was a Palmach soldier. So I'm not a scholar. These two are scholars, they know better than me, like the technology. But remember, this attack happened 7 days after the declaration of the state. So how they organized and made it this official army is a whole other question that I can't answer. When I met with Ben Frieden, who led the attack, and I also met with Henro, who's in this film, they were taking it like military, matter of fact. This was our brigade. This is what we did. This was a strategy. Like, they said this to me, and I have it on film. There wasn't a guilt to them. They see it as war. Like, they see it as command and war, and we achieved what we set out to do. So, and then I also met with Herbert Pundik, who was in Tantura. It was one of the soldiers. His son was one of the people that spearheaded the Oslo Accords. And Herbert was like them. I don't remember. Of course they remember, but I almost got the sense like they were sort of, they had kind of an understanding to not remember, maybe to not share whatever happened. I don't know. I'm just saying this is my experience talking to them. When I spoke with Herbert Pundik, with Benz and Henro, who's in this film as well, no one got specific. They didn't, but they definitely said there was an attack. They definitely acknowledged people were killed.
And what do you say to the question about the usefulness of this film, in the sense that it provides a perspective, it may be speaking to a different audience? What's your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. Who's the audience? It's probably, I don't have an answer for that, except that I can say that I do appreciate that it's another layer of people admitting to what happened, even if it's not a direct admission. I mean, it's clear something happened, right? Of course. I mean, my uncle was at the gravesite collecting the bodies and throwing at gunpoint, having to throw the bodies into the grave. I mean, he was literally there. He's still alive. He's also in my film.
Yes. Thank you. Professor Avi?
There was a sense of guilt on the part of some of the veterans, but not all of them. Most of them were rather pragmatic. They said, it happened, but let's not talk about it. So there was denial and repression. Some of them did express a sense of guilt, but that's individual sense of guilt. It's not good enough for me, because there are two powers who were responsible for the Nakba and for the ongoing Nakba, and that's Britain and Israel. Britain enabled the Zionist movement to embark on the systematic takeover of the whole country. Zionism is about land grabbing. In 1917, when Balfour issued his famous declaration, the Jews were 10% of the population and they owned 2% of the land. In 1947, during the UN partition resolution, Noor said that the Jews owed 10% of the land.
6.5% to the GNF, I think.
Too generous.
Yeah.
It was 7%.
No, actually, I think it was 6.5%.
Well, let's not die on a pinhead here. We
but-
can say somewhere between 6.5 and 7.
But the UN allocated 55% of Palestine to the Jews. And by the end of the war, Israel was in control of 78% of historic Palestine, everything except the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And today, Israel controls, and in 1967, Israel completed the capture of the whole of Palestine. So I would like an admission of guilt and responsibility by Britain. But I don't have time to go over the history of the British mandate in Palestine, but I can summarize it to you in one sentence. The British mandate in Palestine consisted of Britain stealing Palestine from the Palestinians and giving it to the Zionists. And yet, has there ever been any acknowledgement of Britain's role in the Nakba and in the ongoing Nakba? Not only that, but in the recent trade agreement between Britain and Israel, it didn't only deal with trade. It said Britain pledged to oppose the referral of the Palestine issue to the UN. Britain is opposed to BDS. Britain will work to reduce the focus on Palestine at the UN. Sorry, to reduce the focus on Israel at the UN. So there hasn't been a hint of acknowledgement of Britain's historic responsibility, nor has there been any acknowledgement by Israel of even a part of the share of the responsibility for the Nakba. Complete denial. Does the film provide some insight into the thinking of Israelis? It most certainly does. A lot of insight into the complex psychology of the veterans. But the film doesn't expose that the collective view of Israel about itself, the notion that the Israeli army is the most moral army in the world, this is a myth. It never existed, and it's preposterous to regard Israel, the Israeli army, with all its long record of war crimes, as a moral army. And Azam Tamimi asked whether the Zionist ideology isn't responsible for the Nakba, for what has happened, and it most certainly is. The Zionist ideology, which is an exclusive ideology, a racist ideology. Israel likes to define itself as both Jewish and democratic. But as one Arab MP has said, Israel is a democracy for the Jews and
Jewish to the Palestinians.
Jewish for the Palestinians. Zionism is racism. Israel cannot be both. Israel is either a racist Jewish state or it's a democratic state for everybody. And that's what I would like Israel to be. I'd like a democratic solution, one state with equal rights for all its inhabitants. Your organization, Human Rights Watch, issued a report last year about Israel, and the conclusion was it is an apartheid state.
The conclusion was that yes, that Israel is committing the crime against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Yeah. Correct.
And there are 4 major human rights groups in the last 2 years who issued similar reports, reached the same conclusion. Israel is an apartheid state. So apartheid is racism. Apartheid is discrimination. But Israel is the only member of the United Nations that I know which is officially racist. And I say this because of the July 2018 nation-state law, which says the Jews have a unique right to self-determination in Israel. Unique means exclusive.
Yes.
It means Arabs have no right to self-determination. It means even if Arabs became a majority, they would still have no right to self-determination. So most certainly, Zionism is a racist ideology, and it is largely responsible for the Nakba that has unfolded throughout the last century and continues today.
Continues today. That's the key point, because I think the strategy in 1948 was maximum land, minimum Arabs. The Israelis did not want to get rid of every single Palestinian. The fact that a minority survived within the Israeli state, minority Palestinians. The strategy in 1948 was maximum land, extending from 55% to 78%, and minimum Arabs in the Jewish states. This is the current Israeli strategy in the West Bank. The Israelis are not talking about two-state solution, one-state solution. They want maximum land from the West Bank, probably Area C is what the Israeli call it, which is about 2/3 of the West Bank, taking the Palestinian cities out of the Jewish state. They already took Gaza out of the Jewish state. This is the lesson from that. This is the threat of 1948. This is the fear of another Nakba. This is why we need to be aware that the current Israeli strategy in the West Bank is to push people out, but also to try to actually, Israel regards most of the West Bank as Israel, by the way. It's the strange thing about how international human rights organizations think about there's Israel and there is the West Bank. In fact, the Israelis think most of the West Bank is Israel. They wiped out the Green Line. Oslo divided the area into area A, B, and C. The PA is actually running area A, which is about 5% of the West Bank. The Israelis consider it 2/3 of the West Bank as Israel. And de facto annexed to Israel. This is where we need, this is why I agree with Avi about we need to catch up with the reality of an apartheid state. But I want to go back to Rada, my friend Rada, and the whole question of is it useful? Is this film useful? And being a historian means actually been following what Israeli historians have been writing for the last 30, 40 odd years, and also I kind of wrote extensively about the so-called new historians in the 90s, when we also met at one point. We used to meet in Paris, and I visited my Haifa University at one point before the boycott issue. And we debated with Israeli historians, and we can see that some genuine Israeli historians who want to acknowledge, who want to debate. We saw it in this film, actually, one or two people from Haifa University. But there's another layer, which is the Israeli collective narrative, which is denial. It is a narrative denial, systematically, from above, by the state. That narrative resulted in Teddy Kurtz having a mental breakdown. The supervisor of Teddy Kurtz's thesis was a Palestinian Jew from Haifa University, had a heart attack during the court thing. Ilan Pappy was driven out of Israel, and within 2 years, he told me he just could not survive at Haifa University, being a co-supervisor of Teddy Kurtz, and he was driven out to Exeter University. So the affair, what the Israelis called parashah of Teddy Kurtz, in fact, it was systematic silencing, and we can see it here. And that narrative is not changing. In fact, with the mountains of Israeli new historiography of the 90s, which was euphoric for some of us, and also cathartic, it's actually, we felt kind of, we can move on. There's a new reality. There is also, there is, in fact, from that period of the 90s till now, the Israeli settlements actually in the West Bank tripled themselves. Israel is much more fascist now. It's much more right-wing. In fact, that phenomena of the 90s, which was about beginning to kind of post-Zionism and acknowledgement and this and that, and real internal Israeli debate, in fact, was completely kind of wiped out. And there was a sense of renewalism in Israel, and the religious right took over, and Israel is more religious. And in fact, Israel actually managed to, settler Zionism actually does renew itself from time to time. The reason I say that, because even in the 50s, there was an Israeli story, a fiction story called Khirbet Khiz'a, which is also acknowledgement of atrocity in 1948 by Smilansky. And so these periods of catharsis, Ghada, you know, how settler colonials actually go through periods of guilt and catharsis and the need to renew itself, in fact, has been accompanying settler Zionism from the beginning of the 19th century, including a Hada'am, beginning 1910 or something like that. There's a lot of renewalism going on in Zionism, and that catharsis helps Zionism to move on to the next stage of dispossessing the Palestinians. This is what an Israeli lawyer explained to me, Liat Semel. Said, no, don't be excited about the 90s and the new historiography. The Israelis will renew themselves, and the Palestinians will pay the price for that kind of renewalism, which they have to do it from time to time. So I do worry about this sort of film, which is kind of helps you to cleanse yourself and to feel good about yourself, but also to move on to the next stage of what do we do now with the concentration of Palestinians in the West Bank, and how do we deal with them? So there is a layer. I think Avish is right about multi-layers in this film. There's a layer which is honest and is about internal debates and about historians who are prepared to acknowledge, and they want to deal with the history, and they want to dig up these graves and want to do what the Spanish did after the Spanish Civil War. Now, these are decent Israelis, by the way. I met them. We know them. We come across them. But there's also a layer which is basically, you know, the feeling of guilt and the feeling of catharsis, and we need to talk about, but internal. It's nothing to do with the Palestinians, it's about us. It's about us as a moral people, as a pure people. And nahnu am tahor, he was saying. We are a pure people. We are a moral people. And the IDF is a Tohar Haneshek, what they call the purity of arms. So there's another layer which is about renewalism, about reestablishing yourself as a virtual colonial settler. Settler colonialism in Palestine was with the singing, which we saw it in the film, of Hevenu Shalom Aleichem. The Israelis ethnic cleansed the Palestinians by singing, we have brought peace to you, we have brought development to you. That aspect of Israeli settler colonialism, which is righteous settler colonialism, it's a settler which feels good about it. And Ilan actually was explaining that. It's a moral. So it's not like the Nazis. The Nazis were vicious and cruel, and the Israelis think they are virtuous colonialists. They are this is one of the reasons why Israel studies is not coming to grips with its colonial nature. We are Jewish and democratic. And again, the big demonstrations we saw recently, it's actually by some senior Israeli officers of the Air Force who are bombing Gaza, but also demonstrating against Netanyahu at the same time. This is what's so it's a settler colonial society which is not like America, not like even Australia. It hasn't gone to that stage. That's why I think we still have the threat of another Nakba. That's why the Palestinian think the Nakba hasn't ended. You know, this is where we need to be careful, and we need to wake up. Wake up people across the world here, create that kind of anti-apartheid movement, and realize that threats haven't gone away. Actually, there are real threats the Palestinians are facing now.
Very, very insightful. I think I'm just going to take my cue from the organisers as to whether we have time for any more questions. I don't think, unfortunately, I'm very sorry, I don't think we have time for any more questions. But you're obviously welcome to come and speak to those that are on the panel. I think they will be asked to do some interviews outside, so they may do that first. But I wanted to take the moment to thank everyone for your time, for being here, for taking the time to watch this film, collectively absorb it, and then, as we were saying, unpick it and considered the many, many important layers of the film together. And I do hope that you can go home after this with some further and important perspectives. So thank you very much for being here, and I'll hand it over to
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings to a conclusion our evening tonight. I'd like to thank the team at ICJP for putting together such a fabulous event, but most of all to Yasmin, Avi, Hala, and Noor. Please can you show your appreciation? Thank you very much.